If you were born before the year 2025, you experienced childhood trauma. I'm going to say that again. If you were born before 2025, aka everyone listening to this, you experienced childhood trauma. And it's one of those things, right? We hear the word trauma and we think that we had bad parents, abusive parents, right? Verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse. They call those big T traumas. But my definition of trauma, and I've bounced this off of a ton of therapists, and they all like my definition. My definition of trauma is anything that alters the natural course of who you were supposed to become. So anything that alters that, right? So somebody could give you advice. Somebody could give you advice, good advice, to get into some sort of successful career and become extremely wealthy, buy everything in the world, win all these awards. That could be trauma. Now hear me out here. Why do I say that? Well, because let's say you were supposed to become a musician or a poet, or maybe you were supposed to open up a daycare. Maybe you had a passion of having a fly fishing company or a rafting company where you take people rafting down the Colorado River. Whatever it is, if that was your dream, that's the thing that lights you up inside. And then your mentors, your parents, television idols, icons, influencers, whatever, if these people convince you that you will be happier, that you will be more connected and you'll have more friends and more people will like you if you became a lawyer, doctor, hedge fund manager, a Wall Street stock trader, any of that influenced you to go that route because you listened to them, right? Oh, I want to have more friends. I want to win more awards. I want people to remember my name. That kind of influence can alter the natural course of where you were going to go, the person you were born to become. That is trauma. It's none of those people's business. They should stay out of your business. I always say this. Parents should keep you from dying, keep you from getting arrested, and keeping you from having a child before you're ready to have a child. Those three things: arresting, having a kid, or dying. Outside of that, stay out of your kid's business. Here's the thing. We see these bad kids, rebellious kids, breaking the rules, whatever. That is a maladaptive behavior from something they learned. Here's the thing that we know about all humans. Humans don't ever intentionally do anything to harm themselves. They would never jeopardize their full potential or harm the potential of another person. Humans just don't do that. A healthy human whose brain's operating correctly, they don't hurt themselves, they don't hurt others. So if we see somebody intentionally hurting themselves, or what looks like intentionally, and we see somebody maybe hurting another person, your first instinct shouldn't be to judge that individual. You should ask what the heck happened to them to get them to make that decision, right? And it's part of the reason why I get so fired up when I see people judging or talking poorly about somebody struggling with sexually compulsive behavior, porn addiction, sex addiction. It really lights me up because I run groups full of very successful men who, some of them donate half of their income to different charitable causes, right? They're on boards of nonprofits. I mean, these are good people. They care about others. They care about their community. They care about their family, their spouse, right? So to cast judgment on this individual based off of their actions and say that, oh, that's a measure of their character, I disagree. I think people's actions are a byproduct of their upbringing, their environment, the people who are around them. It's a byproduct of the things that influence them. I don't think it's a reflection of their character. I think that's extremely inaccurate. But back to kind of the trauma piece, right? We talk about this in the sex addiction world that, most, if not all, people with compulsive sexual behavior came from their childhood trauma, right? You'll hear that over and over again. And it's true, but I think a big barrier is the word trauma. There's so many people who think, oh, I had great parents. I used to say that. I always said, oh my gosh, I had great parents because they loved me. They did everything. We were poor, but they did everything that they could, even despite how poor we were, to have a good life. But me having a good child is complete nonsense, right? Just because they loved me and just because they wanted to love me doesn't mean that they did a good job. I think the most common trauma, especially amongst high achievers and successful men, is a performance-based household. You'll see two different kinds of parents with successful men, right? It's either a performance-based household full of what people would call good parents. Maybe they have financial means, they're home a lot, they're attending all of their kids' sporting events, they're coming to all the kids' after school activities, they're very involved in their kids' lives. The child's under the impression that, oh wow, I have great parents, right? And usually these parents are kind of tooting their own horn, right? They're bragging about, oh, I would never miss any of your sport games, honey, or oh, all those other parents, they're very, very busy and they work and we don't do that. We spend time with you guys. We want to go on great family vacations, right? So a a lot of the times these parents are kind of reinforcing that their parenting strategy is the best parenting strategy or a good parenting strategy. But again, I think that just depends on the measure, right? If the measurement of good parenting is how many financially successful kids that you can raise, okay, then maybe they were good parents if that's the measure. But to me, what's more important? A child who grows up to become financially independent and is able to retire in their late 40s, is that really success? What if they're miserable? What if they're empty inside? What if they spent their whole life selling something or doing a career that they hated, all to what? Retire early and get a bunch of money? Is that a successful life? Is that what you want for your children? So when we're thinking about us, for everybody listening to this, right, and we're wondering, why am I engaging in this unwanted behavior? Why have I become addicted to sex or pornography? How did I get to this point where I'm paying for sex, hiring prostitutes, using women, one-night stands, cheating on my wife? It is from your childhood trauma. Now, this is a huge rabbit hole, and we could talk about this for days and days and days. I mean, I could have an entire podcast around childhood trauma and sex addiction and porn addiction that would follow. But my point of this particular recording was to just open everyone's eyes to the fact that I don't think there's a person out there who didn't experience a degree of trauma, right? And they had to course correct. And some of them had great parents, and maybe they accidentally traumatized their kids by, forcing their beliefs on them or overly encouraging them to go do something. And then they think, shoot, should we have really forced them to do that? Was that kind of wrong? And then you can always course correct. But those are still traumas, even if you course correct, right? Somebody knocking you off the course because you feel like you would be more loved or a better person, that's traumatic. That's not your course. Your parents' job was to have you become you, right? Figure out what your unique abilities are, what your passions are, the things that motivate you so you can live this really fulfilled life that's full of, abundance and opportunity. That's their job. But we don't do that, right? Between school, television, the different influencers out there on social media, there's so much information coming at people these days, convincing them who they need to become. It's to the point where, we don't raise kids to think independently. We raise them to be successful, to fulfill their full potential according to us, right? Our definition of success, our definition of a good life. But that's not our job. So to come back to kind of how this affects men, it's a bunch of different ways, right? If you're led to believe that the more money you accumulate and the less debt you have, that makes you a good person, that's the measure of a good life, then you're going to put a ton of focus on that, right? And that could create other voids in your life, right? You might spend too much time working and not enough time connecting with others or giving love or receiving love from others. And so what's it going to do? What's that void going to turn into? Well, it could turn into a sex and porn addiction. It could turn into a substance addiction. It could turn into a series of divorces and broken relationships from your inability to connect, right? Let's use another example. Let's say that your girlfriend broke up with you when you were 12 years old and she decided to date your best friend. And your best friend was more muscular than you. He was more tan than you. His teeth looked better than you. His parents were rich and your parents were poor. That breakup could carry with it a very significant conclusion, right? You could draw a conclusion that she left you because your parents didn't have enough money, right? She left you because your clothes weren't the right brands, right? Your clothes weren't nice enough. I mean, who knows the story that this 12-year-old boy is going to tell himself about why his girlfriend left him and chose his best friend. But again, that story he tells himself is trauma. And that's what I really wanted to get at here was I lived my whole life thinking that I was not traumatized, that I had a perfect childhood. And the dangers of that is that anything that's screwed up is your fault. You blame yourself, right? That's where the shame comes in. I am a bad person. I'm a stupid person. I'm an irresponsible person, whatever the story may be. And that's your conclusion based off of the data that you're getting. And that's what we're talking about here with trauma. I want everyone to stop thinking about the big T traumas, right? Sex abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and think about just lessons that you would learn. One of the stories I always tell people about my own trauma was we had this very wealthy family friend, and I was over at his house and he was up in his office and he said, "Hey, Roland, come over here." And he showed me his computer, and his computer had all these red and green numbers. And he was showing me, "Hey, see all the green on there? That's how much money I made." He said, "Hey, since you and your family have been here, we were only there for an hour. I've made $18,000 doing nothing," right? And he was trying to teach me about the concept of compound interest, right? And investing in the stock market. While he meant well, all I heard was, wow, this guy knows way more than my poor dad knows. And everybody loves this guy, right? Here he is. We're at his 13-bedroom mansion for this party. He's got everybody over. Everybody loves this guy. He always throws the best parties. Everybody at church loved this guy, right? They looked at him differently than they looked at everybody else. So what was the story that I was telling myself as a young man? Watching that, I was thinking, wow, if I'm going to become a somebody, I need to learn how these red and green numbers work. And so that was trauma. If he had not gone there and encouraged me to, hey, Roland, you need to figure this out if you're going to become a somebody. He didn't quite say that, but that was kind of what was insinuated was, look how special I am. Hey, you should go learn how to make passive income so you can be super rich, right? Again, he didn't say that, but that was what I concluded. And that's why, I say this for two reasons. One, so that you can honor some of those life experiences that happened to you, the things that you might not consider trauma that actually changed the way you thought because of the conclusion that you drew. A more simple story that I always tell is I had these two best friends. It was the three of us. And one summer they decided to just unfriend me. Out of nowhere. They didn't return my calls. They started hanging out without me and not inviting me. And I can't remember what I concluded, but I felt very rejected. I felt unwanted. That was the second time that had happened, right? So now I was thinking something was wrong. People don't want to be friends with me. And there's some sort of reason for that. I'm not cool enough. I'm not funny enough. We were poor and a bunch of rich people built around us. So I accidentally grew up in a very wealthy neighborhood. So a lot of the stories that I told myself was, I'm not rich enough. My clothes aren't nice enough, right? I'm not cool enough. My parents don't drop me off in a nice enough car. Our house is too small and too poor, right? And so I had an LDS family, and I was always getting made fun of for the religion that my parents had chosen. So I hated the Mormon church because, again, everyone's making fun of me and calling me names. So my point of all of saying some of these examples is the conclusion that you come to has consequences, right? As you can hear some of my stories, I became obsessed with money, right? I thought money was going to be the answer. I thought it was going to solve all my problems, right? I thought money and being able to get girls was going to be the answer. Look what happened to me, right? It created all the problems and nearly destroyed my marriage right now with my soulmate, right? So I wanted to say one more quick story for people kind of wrestling with what's childhood trauma. I had a perfect childhood. Oh my gosh, I cannot tell you how many times I've had people tell me they had a perfect childhood. Again, this isn't just about your parents. The story I'm about to tell you is about kids. There was a guy at one of my retreats, and he was just sitting there, and we have this little exercise that we do to kind of identify some of the traumatic things that happened in your life, and his was blank. And he was just saying, oh, I had a great childhood. Nothing really happened to me before I was 10 years old. And then as we're kind of sharing stories, he raises his hand. He's like, actually, hey, I remembered something. He said there was this older kid and he kept messing up my hair and picking on me and bullying me. And this next day I didn't want to take it anymore. I wasn't going to let him. And so he spent time sharpening a little piece of metal and he hid it in his mouth. He hid it in his mouth because he knew that bully was going to come and he was going to pull this little thing out of his mouth and he was going to slice him. And he did it. And then the bully, ran off and never bullied him again. But this is a kid who told me I had a perfect childhood. You tell me this, is sharpening a blade and hiding it in your knife a normal childhood, right? Going to school feeling like you need to bring a sharpened piece of metal to defend yourself. I mean, imagine what it's like to be that kid, wondering when you're going to get bullied, who's going to bully you, right? To feel like you're justified in slicing this kid with a sharpened blade. That's an example. I think it's really hard to remember life before we were 10, but at the same time, those are the most formative years. I know this podcast was a little scattered, but it was my best efforts to really just kind of shine light on what trauma is. Trauma can be things that look really, really good. Trauma can be really, really bad things. It can be anything between. But remember the definition, right? It's anything that somebody or someone or something is going to do to you where you're going to draw some sort of conclusion that you decide to become someone else besides who you were born to be. And every time I see somebody do this, every time, something bad happens. It might be sex or porn addiction. It might be horrible money habits. It might be poor self-esteem. It might be poor body image. Some problem, ruined marriages, poor parenting, blah, blah, blah. Some problem is going to happen when you are off course. Something bad will happen. So again, explore your traumas because sometimes you don't even know you're off course until you really start tracing back into life. Why do I believe what I believe and what events in my life made that happen? And that's when you really start to wonder, how much of the person I'm supposed to become am I today?